I guess, okay.
Go for
So, because you hit me up this week and then I had questions.
it. Okay.
It's just like, but then these are like, okay. So these are like questions that I've been realizing that like I have for a lot of people.
Mhm.
It's just like, because like when you meet someone, you've existed for, at this point, probably like 30, 31 years
Mhm.
prior to knowing,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So if you're 34, we've known each other for like 3 years. And it's like there's 31 years that I have no clue about,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I think about that sometimes.
I'd be like, damn, bro. So like,
So a lot happens in 31
yeah.
years. Yeah.
But then like, so like, because I get to meet you at the conclusion of a lot of things,
Mhm.
and I didn't go through a lot of the things to get to that conclusion. So
Yeah.
I just, a lot of times for me, I just be wondering like, dang, how did people get to where they are?
Facts.
And so like, even with this stuff, like, because I know we've talked about it, but like you have a history in Christianity.
Mhm. Yeah.
So like, how do you get from Christianity that demonizes everything that you do currently
Right.
to now this?
Yeah. That's a leap. Um. So Judeo-Christian background, um, which I feel like a lot of black people in the country can identify with. It's like the default. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of conversation about the black church out there and just like the black church experience. But yeah, heavy Judeo-Christian background, and I grew up in Massachusetts, and so a church saying that it was a non-denominational church basically meant that it was the widest interpretation of Christianity that you could possibly imagine. Like when I think about even what the word denomination means, it's like that's literally like a reference to tribal organization, I guess, or compartmentalization. And to say like, oh, we are non-denominational, it's like to take all the culture out of the religion. I just went to so we just drove through the Midwest. We just went through Tulsa, Oklahoma, all the way up to Cleveland, Ohio, right? And we're sitting at this event, and there's this family behind us, and I remember we're sitting there, and I hear there's a baby who wouldn't stop talking or like just making baby noises. So the mom is like Ezekiel or like whatever the hell she said, right? And I was like, I was trying not to crack up laughing because it occurred to me like, yo, there's an entire culture of people who are out here who basically like blackface their experience through the lens of the the Hebrew experience, right? And when I say like Hebrew experience, I mean like the historical Hebrew, right? So like not the religious aspect. Um, so this blonde, blue-eyed little boy's name is Ezekiel, right? Or Malachi. That's what it was, Malachi, which is even worse to me. So it's like you have Malachi, which is like Malachi, right? Like that's like the actual name, and you're like, bro, you're seated in the land of people who hate people who come from where that name came from, but they will name you that with their whole chest because of what they align with their religion, and it doesn't occur to them that the religion is actually rooted in an experience that they like vehemently push away. And so it was just wild to be like, yo, I'm really in the buckle of the Bible Belt. Like these folks really will take everything from the culture except the culture itself and the respect for it. But yeah, so that's the I didn't grow up in that, but something similar in the sense that it was a very like self-righteous or self-assured view of Christianity. Um, and that being said, like I used to focus on the trauma of my particular experience, and now I see that it's a way more shared experience, where the default is demonization of indigenous thought, philosophy, and spiritual awareness. Um, so, for example, um, I mean, like, I'm trying to even think of where to start because it's like you can go anywhere from translation to culture, where like I've thought about it from I've thought about it from an external point of view before, where if you come from a background where like your entire life is kind of roped around the morality of your behavior as it's tied to these divine beings or references that you have in your experience, to go somewhere where maybe the iconography is like the inverse of what you expect, right? So like you go to a land where like snakes are revered for whatever reason. The things that they do to edify the divine through the lens of that creature are going to seem inherently evil to you off the bat because you have a fear for that iconography. But like that experience would have alleviated the concern or fear for that thing. And so if you don't, so much of the grace and the connection that we're looking for requires seeing the full human experience in someone else's thing. You know what I mean? Because if you start there, if you start with a relationship, the ability to understand is almost inherent. But if you just start with analyzing and projecting, well, does this meet my standards for X? That's where you get like really messed up.
You know how many things don't meet your standards? Like,
where do your standards even come from?
You don't even meet your standards.
Ooh, that's the big one. You don't even meet your standards. I mean, that's almost the American experience across the board, especially when it comes to that Christian identity. We don't meet the standards or expectations of what that religion claims to be about. But from the lens of tribalism, I can also see why in America it kind of gives people the license to, I'm trying to think what's the word. It gives them like that license or permission to kind of go off when it comes to the xenophobia, when it comes to the hate, when it comes to like really I think about like all the identity stuff that people talk about.
It's like the lack of understanding.
You said what?
The lack of understanding is inherent.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that became discouraging is you start to recognize like how much of that has to do with people just not allowing someone else to be human to the extent that they are. And it can be disheartening because you're like, wow, you really don't see the humanity in me. Like, you really don't see the person. It just stops at, like, demon for you.
So then, I guess, like, how do you get from... So then how does the transition start then? Because, like...
So, I like that question because I think, especially because of the way that I speak on things, people assume that the transition started with knowledge or some sort of, like, intellectual working of... And it's like, no, it's just anger. Like, just being mad and being like, yo, fuck this shit. This doesn't make sense. This doesn't resonate. This doesn't... Whatever word you want to use, it's the fuck this shit. But it wasn't... The knowledge came later. The anger lit the fire under my ass to go figure it out. And I think that's just a result of growing up in a space where people are constantly telling you that you don't exist. And whatever that might mean to you. Like, for some people, that's sexuality. Some people, that's gender. Some people, that's race. Some people, it's their culture. Like, you know, I think everybody's gone through experiences where, like, either, let's say their music is demonized, their clothing is demonized, the way they speak is demonized. And the knee-jerk reaction is anger. So that was definitely the point of departure. The point of departure was anger, and also the relationships that I had. So instead of being aligned with my relationships within that church construct, my closer friendships or the ways in which I felt loved and accepted were with groups of people who were outside of that construct. So you start to align with everything in your head that makes their experience not what yours was. And that's where like the self-destructive behavior really comes in. So I think there's all these like there's all these like almost like self-fulfilling prophecies that occur when you're trying to separate from that Christian background or that religious background, like that's steeped in just the religion, not the spiritualism, where you can only afford to do the opposite of everything that you've been told in an effort to find the truth, because you're like, the truth is not present in the things you told me, so I gotta like go deep hard into like, let me try the smoking and the drinking and the sex and the fucking. It's like I'm going to, like, no one curses more than a church kid. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, bro, they'll find ways to engineer a sentence. I used to have to think about the curse words of a sentence before I would say it, because I had to like, I had to orchestrate the shit. Because in my mind, I'm like, damn, y'all just like, it's so unnatural to me. But I recognize this freedom in the way that you speak or the way that you express yourself that I'm chasing. So I'm going to, because life has only occurred to me through prescribed behavior, I'm just going to switch my prescription. It doesn't occur to me that like the natural flow or the organic flow is even valuable. So when you switch, in my church, it was called the double life. Like they would talk about double life a lot, especially with the teens. So it's like, oh, you say you act one way at home, but you have your, you listen to the worldly or the secular music, or you dance this way or you talk this way at school. So I was like heavy on that. And for me, I wasn't really affirmed either in that. Because socially, I was heavily bullied in school, like up till probably late high school. And I think it's just because like kids can kind of sniff it out, where it's like, you're not really like that. And so they'll poke and prod and try to figure out what it is, like how do you tick, or why are you different? But yeah, so the double life thing was really heavy up until like my late teens, and then there was anger with my parents. My parents divorced, like a lot of people's parents divorced. So disillusioned with religion, disillusioned with my projections of family and that expectation, disillusioned with my projections of love, because of, with crumbling family dynamics, the relationship you have with your parents is only bound to be impacted. So as those relationships crumble away, I was seeking out new ways to fill the holes that were showing up. And so, which is why I've talked about like the Life Path 11 stuff or the Life Path 22 stuff, where I'm like, oh yeah, I know what the low vibrational aspect of that is, because it stems from the chase, when you're seeking fulfillment. So the emotional gatekeeping of the people around you, constantly trying to pay attention and prepare yourself for their emotional reactions so that you're ignoring your own. And then that somehow turning you into an empath and you making that a superpower for yourself. Like, ooh, I'm so good at sensing other people's feelings. It's like, bro, you have no idea what you're feeling. That's why you're so good at that. And it also suggests that you've not been able to be in an environment and feel safe because someone else's emotional reaction might inflict your capacity for safety. Whether it's like abuse or neglect, or your ability to receive love in a particular moment. That's where those things start to pop up. But because of that, the information shows up. So I'm like doing research. I'm seeing people talk about like having an empathic experience. And I'm like, oh, that sounds like me. Or like, oh, I feel like I can read people's minds and stuff like that. And it's like, I don't want to invalidate anyone's experience, because for me it's a yes and. But the yes and is, with all of your traumatic experience reinforcing that you need to pay that much attention to the social environment around you, that's more what's going on than you're an X-Men walking through reality. You know what I'm saying? And even the media that we watch, like everything's so geared towards a hero mentality that even if there is something that's like different or odd about your experience, which I think a lot of neurodivergents get burdened with, you have this feeling of like responsibility, like I'm supposed to be some benefit to the general population. I need to do something with this. And it's like, how many more ways can the indigenous way of being or thought be gaslit than to be told, for the sake of the Western world and civilization, lay yourself down on the sword and use your gifts only for the best of everyone except for yourself. white man hero complex. So that confronting that white man hero complex changed the way that I saw any savior narrative, much less the Christian savior narrative. And so as you start to explore that and realize, like, yo, not only was this person not white, but the experience that they had culturally was so far divorced from the one that I've had, even the things that are being translated about what he was trying to say wouldn't make sense in the context of this world. So I started to do a lot more research. That was where the knowledge started to show up. So the cultural knowledge, the cultural context, the historical knowledge and context of regions, cultures, groups of people, and even languages, like the way that language occurs. All of that starts to change the way that you read the scripture that you were given in the beginning. So the wild part for me is, like, I tell people now, there's so much value in the Bible that but like to read it now and go through it now, I disseminate the information way differently. But coming at it like you're, regular Western American, that shit was just dangerous. It was a dangerous weapon.
Funny, Hebrew to English is not a one-to-one translation.
Right. But you know what's wild about that?
Aramaic to Hebrew to all this is not a one-to-one translation.
At all. What's wild about that is I remember going to seminars and I remember being taught by some of the pastors, preachers, whatever, that it was in fact a one-to-one, and that I remember specifically being told that the accuracy was somewhere between, like, we'll say like 80 and 90% for the translation. Now as an adult, as a 34-year-old adult, I'm like, bro, how do you even qualify that? How do you quantify that? How do you figure out that, like, oh, it's this percentage accurate? Like, who is the person who's even declaring the point of validity for that, or accuracy? Yeah, it doesn't even make sense. So, and like when someone who doesn't speak the language is telling you how accurate to the language they don't speak. When someone who doesn't speak the language is telling you how accurate to the language they don't speak the translation is, the whole thing starts to crumble in a really disgusting way. And that was like, I think that was the second part of it. So all right, so there's like, I would say that I would probably break it down into 3 parts at this point. So the first part was the disillusionment, which led to anger. And so you just kind of have the backlash, like the reaction of, like, I'm going to go hard in the other direction. Then there's the logic thing starts to pop up, and you start moving through it intellectually because you've kind of removed yourself for long enough to go, let me think about this critically. Then you go to informed dissent. So it's like you start to rack up evidence because in your mind you're defending against the arguments against all your loved ones and all the people that you know up to this point are going to say the way that you're going about things is wrong, or so you have to, like, pad yourself because your internal dialogue is going to be geared towards that conscience that they prescribe to you. So there's like the informed dissent, and then I think after that came like the DGAF era, where it's just like, yo, I don't give a fuck. So I'm not debating it with you. I'm not justifying my point of view to you. You can figure it out for yourself. And then after that became like the new evangelist. So it's like, yo, I need to go around and tell everybody how trapped by religion they are and preach to them the new good word. And it's like a cycle. You come right back around to the beginning because now you're evangelist again. And I think I get to now, which is a newer space for me, but it's still evangelism, I guess, because I'm out here creating content and we're shooting stuff and, like, I'm putting up stuff and putting the word out. But it's based in seeking to truly free people. Again, it's so funny because it's like, yo, how is that not the same rhetoric? But I spend more time trying to explain to people what they think is naturally, or what the conclusions they've already arrived at is correct.
I think that's the difference, right? Like, you're not imposing your own thoughts and understandings. You're more so confirming what you both agree on.
Yeah, it's a lot of confirmation, a lot of validation. I think so even for you to use that point, confirming what you both agree on, I no longer need to agree.
Yeah.
Like the need to agree is gone.
Yeah.
I don't even.
That's the other thing, bro.
Like, for what? If that's the way that you've experienced it, if that's the way that it's come around for you, then it's like, who am I to deter you from that?
Christian evangelism is, yeah, like they consider themselves failures if you don't agree with what they believe in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's just like,
yeah, like I wasn't convincing enough.
Yeah.
Which was a lot. I remember that coming up in church, where it's like they would talk about your capacity to.
Yeah, but I mean, even like you listen to sermons, bro. It's like this seems like what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're just trying to convince me of something. It's
Yeah.
Like, if we're all in the same place and we agree on this, why are we still doing this?
The funny thing is like some of the most fundamental points of dissent or departure from the philosophy, you get to as a kid, because you're like, all right, so God made everything, yep, and everything is good, yep. So why are we the ones, like, why is God on our side versus everybody else? Like, why are there sides?
Yeah.
Well, there are some people who are just evil, and it's like, well, you kind of just walk me through the forgiveness of sins and like the idea that no one's inherently evil, so which one is it? And there's a lot of doublespeak with the Christian way of thought, which if you make everything, I think a lot of what is most poisonous about religion is the application of binary thought. So if you make things right or wrong, if you make things yes or no, black or white, that's where you run into the biggest danger area. So with that binary aspect, it's like, if you don't, like, Paul is one of the people that I use as an example the most, because to me, Paul is the voice of whiteness in the New Testament, because most of what he says has to do with groupings of people doing things from a cultural standpoint, and him saying, God doesn't like that, don't do that. And if you go back and you read it now, it's like, all right, this is my analogy for Paul. Spoiler warning: if you're sensitive, you may want to just skip through this part. But my analogy for Paul is like, imagine the Black Lives Matter movement pops up, right? And Paul, being a cop, like, and he's like, when I tell you that he's a cop, he's like got a rap sheet of like complaints for being overly violent, for being abusive, for locking people up and like planting evidence. Like, he's the dirtiest of dirty cops. And then one day he wakes up and is like, yo, you know what? Black Lives Matter. Then, not only does he go Black Lives Matter, he goes and co-ops the whole movement and starts telling the Black Lives Matter movement how they can best tell people how Black Lives Matter. That, to me, is an example of what Paul did with Christianity. Like, you were literally part of the group that nailed this dude to the wood. Like, you were like, yo, like, and I mean within the construct of, like, if you go, like, if we're not being overly concerned with historical accuracy, just the story alone, the presentation of the story. So this guy within your religion comes up, you do everything to tear down what he's about, and find his followers and persecute them. You have an experience by yourself in the middle of the desert somewhere, and then lo and behold, you wake up and you're now like the biggest proponent for preaching this guy's way of like doing things, but not saying what he said, writing letters to groups of people based on the projections of the things that the guy said, what they would mean to those groups of people. You get what I'm saying? That's Paul. That's my experience with Paul. I won't say that that is definitively what happened, but what I read and what I see and how I project that on reality as I see it, that seems to be what it was. A cop going into BLM and being like, you know, guys, Black Lives Matter, and we really need to make sure that we let people know. We should do it like this. And like just starts going on. It's like, bro, like, if you really believed what you say you believe in, you would sit the fuck down and not be speaking at all. And so Paul is like the worst white ally to me. Like, that's like, he's a archetype.
So after you don't give a fuck,
Yep.
then you get to, like, what comes after that? You get to new knowledge?
So I think once you move past the nihilism of none of this shit matters, the inevitable endpoint of that is if nothing matters, everything matters. And I think that explains or describes more so where I'm at now, where it's easier for me to embrace the truth that is present in everyone's perception. It's one of those things that's really hard to communicate because there's a part of my ego that recognizes how that sounds, where it's like, it seems like a cop-out, or it seems escapist, which refers back to the binary point that I was talking about, where it's like, if everything is either you're right or you're wrong, you're engineered to think that you need empirical evidence in order to arrive at a conclusion. When you no longer need empirical evidence, the world gets very gray. And for people who have only operated black and white or refuse to operate any other way, gray is extremely dangerous. And people will defend the perception of their black and white with every ounce of their strength. And I think that's where you get into, relationships that crumble, family ties that crumble from people stepping away from those religious modes of thought, is their loved ones seeing the danger that occurs in like having to shift into a gray area, because you have to take on more personal accountability in a gray area. When things are in black and white, you don't have to take accountability for making the decision of whether or not something was right or wrong, which I think even politically, you look at the situations that we're in, and people are very content to just align with their political party. So they won't do the work to figure out, let's say for abortion, or let's say for like the just women's rights and access to healthcare. They won't do the work to figure out if that's the moral ground they want to stand on. Because they've figured out whatever aligns with their benefit system, they've decided that's my moral compass, so this is white and everything else is black. So if it runs antithetical to this, it's evil, or it's bad, or it's dangerous. Gray would require them to properly research, properly weigh out the perspectives, properly weigh out their lack of perspective and experience, and in most cases their lack of control, as well as just, their own traumas. A lot of people are they're much more concerned with what everyone else is doing when they judge themselves for everything that they've done. So I definitely see that present.
So then, so like, I guess, like what leads you to like start doing this research though, for this stuff?
So when I think about what leads me to the research, it was having mentors. I would say having a mentor who taught me how to ask better questions was instrumental, because to allow myself to ask better questions put me in a position where I had to think deeper about something, or confront how many assumed values I had. I'm trying to think of how to like kind of put it. Like we mentioned that DGAF part. The DGAF part takes place after the validation part, to me, or in my experience. That took place afterwards. So I had already gone through my paces of like needing to rack up the evidence, because after the anger, you need to go around and tell everybody who tried to tell you about yourself, or you need to go around and tell them how wrong they were. So you spend like a couple of years just researching and getting enough under your weight so that every time that your mom criticizes a decision of yours, you can be like, no, because this. No, that scripture doesn't even say that, because this. Like I became really quick to do that. So the DGAF comes after, where you're like sick of having to justify or realize that you no longer need to. Where it's like people dissent with your opinion, or and you just remove yourself or just disengage. I think now I'm at a point where I can challenge someone without getting personally invested. Which I think is like, that's when you become truly impactful. When you're not personally invested, but you're literally just equipping someone with the tools to be more resolute in what they say they believe. I don't give a shit what you believe. If you still want to wake up and pray to Jesus every morning, if you want to wake up and face Mecca and bow 5 times, if you want to wake up and meditate until your fucking beard falls off, I don't give a shit. Just have an approach of, I wouldn't even say that. Because I used to be like, man, critical thinking. At that point, that's what was important. It's like, are you even thinking about this critically? Does it work for you? Does it bring you peace? Cool. Because I only want to interact with you on the basis of you being a peaceful person. So anything else that's going to bring you to another point, that's not necessary for our interaction. Whatever that means for you, that's cool. You know what I mean? If you need to do that thing to validate what you believe, if you need to do that thing in order to like make the people in your past wrong, whatever you need to do for you, do that. But it's not for me, so I don't care. But I do enjoy putting people through the paces of like, stand on that shit you said, basically. And if you're not aware that you're standing on quicksand, I'm only doing you a disservice if I don't point it out and say, hey, like you're kind of sinking through your logic right now. So I think that's more so my intent nowadays when I challenge things is, I would like to see you on safe ground. So I'm going to point out that that's shaky. And if you want to move, that's up to you. If you decide to stand there, that's also up to you. I'm just not going to stand there. And you let me know if you need some help when and if you fall. Because the other thing is, someone may go through their entire life. Someone may go through their entire life and never have to face the shallowness of their belief. And that's okay. I think the turning point for me was when I recognized that, like, my grandmother is super religious, right? Like, that's really the matriarch of the family on my mom's side. It was like, she's always led the charge for what was, like, the standard for faith in the family. When I recognized that with the time that she has left, for her to evolve her understanding of God would do more to damage her general sense of peace than it would to affirm any type of like love that the divine has for her. It was like, who would I even want her to do this for? Would it be for my benefit, which is more likely tied to the traumas of abuses of other people? It don't really have anything to do with her. So it's like, I would think that I'm releasing her from this thing or liberating her from this way of thinking. And in reality, it's like, I'm actually forcing her to go into this space of like questioning, uncertainty, and fear for the rest of the time that she has left, which is nowhere near the amount of time that I have left, God willing. Why would I do that? If she's affirmed that the life she's lived up to this point is going to afford her a long-lasting relationship or experience with God outside of that, expected church thing, who am I to take that from her? I could just let her have that. It's only an issue when she starts to tell me that I'm not walking with God, and she doesn't do that. But it's like, that's the point where it becomes an issue. And even then, I don't need to prove anything to her. It's such an expansive conversation. Like, if someone really tries to be like, so how'd you, like, I never know how to answer when someone asks me, how'd you get here?
But then, because then outside of the experience of church Christianity, there's other things that transpire in life that also lead you there.
Yeah. Right? That's not the only wound that contributed to my trauma, and like the only thing that led to my spiritual awareness was just my church background. I think that would be an extension of the trauma, is trying to limit it to like, this is the thing that.
Well, it's like, no.
It was everything.
This is a part of it.
Yeah.
One of the like the child rearing, when raised by people who are religious, the child rearing becomes a concern as well because they live in black and white. It's like it's this or it's this. And like like you said, like the expression of humanity is limited within these confines because of it's black and white. Like if you exist on this side of the line, well, that's wrong. And spare the rod, spoil the child. So like,
right.
So then like, but then like, once you get away from the child rearing aspect and the religious aspect and everything, like you get into this area where you're like, it's you. And like you said, you're doing that. Like a lot of times people go into that self-destructive phase. It's like, what are the things that come up in that self-destructive phase that then, like, because like all of the things that happen before this point, you go to that point, get to here, there's a line there.
Yeah.
Whether it's up and down, swiggly, there's a line from where you were to where you are now. So like in that self-destructive phase, like what things come up there that also lead you to this point as well?
Okay, I see what you're saying. So at a certain point in the spiritual journey, the confusion of lived experience pops up. So let's say just within the construct of Christianity, you live in a way where you avoid sin for a certain amount of time. Then you hit the anger point, so you try to lean into what was said to be sin hard, which only reinforces that actually is destructive behavior. So now you're in this cognitive dissonant space where you're like, okay, well, it's not good, but it's not explicitly bad. Where's the line? And that's where I talk about like being forced to the gray area. I came up with this analogy the other day for religion and people's adherence to it. If you know the Aesop fable, the tortoise and the hare, right? So the moral of the story at the end is slow and steady wins the race. The way that people consume and integrate religion is similar to hearing that story and deciding that you will not walk over 2 miles an hour for the rest of your life because you want to win the race of life. If that's what you got out of the story that I told you, you didn't get the story. Like, you missed something. And that literal understanding, or that like literal interpretation of religion or religious myth or whatever you want to call it, is what most people's problem is. They're not understanding that there's a principle to the story that they're being told. They're only looking at the surface story and holding themselves accountable to believing the surface information. I need to believe that the world was started with a singular guy, and then a rib was pulled out of him, and another being was made that was a woman, and then they created the rest of humanity. And it's way less important that we understand, in my opinion, it's way less important that I understand that history occurred that way, and more important that I understand how the God of someone's fathers creates their divine relationship with the world around them. So Adam, in his relationship with God, was given dominion to name things and categorize things and determine for himself what was of what use and how to communicate that to other people, which is a level of dominion that's a level of authority. And then when Eve comes in, the assumed messaging there is this being that's meant to submit to him in that construct. He now has the authority or the power to give that person the information, and so on and so forth, right? But they, when we talk about like the perception, like the double slit experiment, it's basically like seeing the particle or the wave. The thing that you call it is the thing that it is. That's what the Adam and Eve story is meant to tell you. But if you're so bent on Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, or yeah, it was these two white folks with fig leaves on their junk, you're missing the entire point of the joint, and you're not going to be held accountable to the divine lesson that's actually present in that word. And so I think that's that to me is a good example of what people deal with, where they try to live out the experience of like Aesop's fable, and then they're upset that it does the events of that story don't manifest themselves in their life, and that wasn't the point. The point was for you to understand the world better through this analogy, so that you could better interact and build a relationship with it and people around you. But we live in a system where being right affords you safety and security. And I think that's another driver, especially when you're talking about the black community or the communities of color. Being right affords us safety. It's why the model immigrant thing is a thing. It's why black elitism and exceptionalism is a thing. Performing to the expectation of excellence within the system affords you safety within the system. At least that's what logic tells you. The problem is that's not true either. And so with it not being true in our lived experience and it's not true in our spiritual or our religious experience, it only stands to reason that like something better has to be sought out. And that's a big part of my whole like decolonize stars. It's like, yo, decolonize your relationship with the universe so that you can get a better grasp of how you contribute to your own experience or your own reality. There are other things that become important to say as a result. One of those things to me is a lot of people will bring their trauma from their religious experience into the spiritualist space. So they'll provide services on the basis of their old like paradigms and constructs.
Still in the space of trying to do the opposite of what was done to them.
So you get these folks who are like, I'm venerated in this, mode of thought or this religious school, or I have this initiation and I think it's, we're in a really weird space with spiritualism and certification where people want to know and they want to trust that you're a trusted source or a viable source for information. And everything that informs them of where that trust should come from is coming from a system that has only raped, abused, and oppressed them. So they're unable to shake that way of thinking. So everyone wants to know like what your qualifications are and who did you learn from and what parts of the world did you go to and and it's like, look it up, get the books, look at the footnotes, look at the annotations, read the source work. In the other cases, like I have books on way more religions than I've ever entertained the idea of being part of in my crib. Just on the basis of wanting to understand that way of explaining existence or that way of explaining the world so I could better communicate with someone in that realm and see the commonality of the experience. So I think that's like when I was younger in church, people like myself were heavily demonized. Like I just put up a ritual video the other day that talked about like a bathing ritual. So it's like magic workers. It was like, that's like the ultimate evil. Those people, I don't think I've met a magic worker who's not more well-versed in scripture and religious texts than any of the people that I grew up in church with. These niggas know the joints inside and out because, again, the principle is clear. You know the spirit that you're appealing to. You understand how, like, the spiritual concepts work. Another thing is, like, quantum physics. A lot of spiritualists are really into quantum physics. It's just a scientific projection of spiritual values in most cases. But again, you're looking for structure in a validation system that you're indoctrinated into. And so that's why you'll cling to these titles. The information's all the same. So whatever your best translation is, I encourage you to lean into it, but also recognize when you're speaking to other people, you may be the only one speaking your language. And so it's more important to sit there and try to figure out what language someone else is speaking than force your language upon them. And if people were more concerned with that than sharing the religion aspect, we'd all be on the same page spiritually. But there's not, everything is, it's so funny because it's like, even with what I said earlier, one of my favorite scriptures from Paul is everything is permissible. It's like, it's all there for you to do, but it's really going to be about your heart behind it that's going to make the difference. I think we can call that.